The night Harlem learned the police would not come was the night the Hoods arrived with rope. It was just after 2 a.m. when the first scream cut through 135th Street. Sharp, short, then silenced. Windows cracked open. Men froze mid-step on the sidewalks. Somewhere, a car engine idled too long, then rolled away slow, like it had nothing to fear. By the time the body hit the pavement, the Klansmen were already gone. No sirens followed. No squad cars screamed down Lenox Avenue. No detectives kicked in doors. And everyone in Harlem understood the message immediately. This wasn't just an attack. It was permission. By sunrise, word had traveled block to block. A young black man, dragged from a boarding house by men in white hoods, beaten within inches of his life, left bleeding beneath a street lamp like a warning sign. The whispers were worse than the facts. Some said the rope had been meant to finish the job. Others said the attackers wore deputy badges under their coats. What mattered was this: the police had been called, repeatedly, and they never showed. By noon, the sidewalks were packed with silence, the kind that hums louder than shouting. Shopkeepers stood in their doorways. Mothers pulled children close. Men who'd survived wars and prison yards stared at the pavement, jaw tight, knowing exactly what this meant. The Ku Klux Klan had crossed into Harlem, and the law had stepped aside to let them. There was only one man in Harlem who didn't lower his voice when he heard the news. They found him that afternoon at the Sugar Ray Bar, sitting alone near the back, coat still on, hat tilted low. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need details. He already knew which police precinct had ignored the calls. He already knew which streets the Klansmen had driven down without being stopped. The legend didn't speak right away. He stirred his coffee once, then he looked up. "So," he said quietly, "they think this is Mississippi." That man was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, Harlem's unspoken line of defense when the law decided it had other priorities. By the mid-1940s, Harlem lived under pressure from every direction. Politicians wanted votes, but not responsibility. Police wanted bribes, but not justice. Southern hate groups believed the North had gone soft, that Harlem could be tested, frightened, broken. They underestimated one thing. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a numbers king or a street boss. He was an organizer, a tactician, a man who understood power better than men with badges ever did. He knew when to stay silent, and when silence became betrayal. This attack wasn't about one victim. It was about whether Harlem would bow. And Bumpy Johnson had never bowed to anyone. Not to mob bosses, not to politicians, and damn sure not to men hiding behind white sheets. By nightfall, Harlem waited, not for the police, but for a response. Because when the law turns its back, legends step forward. By sundown, Harlem felt different, like the air itself had learned to hold its breath. Men gathered in barber shops without getting their hair cut. Card games stayed untouched on folding tables. On stoops, elders spoke in low voices about the last time white hoods had tried to make Harlem remember its place. That had been years ago, long enough for people to start believing it wouldn't happen again. Belief, Bumpy Johnson knew, was a dangerous thing. He left the Sugar Ray Bar just after dark, walking instead of riding, letting the neighborhood see him. Every few steps, someone nodded. No words were exchanged. They didn't need to be. His presence alone told them this hadn't gone unnoticed, that somebody was keeping score. Bumpy had learned long ago that Harlem wasn't controlled with fear. It was held together with memory. Every insult remembered. Every debt counted. Every betrayal recorded. The police precinct on West 126th Street glowed like a fortress that night. Windows lit, doors shut tight. Inside, the radios crackled with routine calls, noise complaints, petty thefts, anything but what had happened that morning. The incident report sat unfinished on a metal desk, written just vague enough to die in a filing cabinet. That was no accident. The captain in charge, a broad-shouldered man with a southern drawl he never quite lost, had already made his position clear. When a patrolman mentioned the beating, the captain's jaw tightened. "Not our problem," he'd said. "Don't go chasing ghosts." Everybody in the room knew what that meant. Bumpy knew it too. That evening, he called a meeting. Not in a back room, not behind locked doors. He chose a public place, a social club on 131st Street where jazz leaked through the walls and the tables were always full. If anyone was listening, he wanted them to hear. The men who came weren't thugs. They were shop owners, drivers, union men, veterans, men with families, men who had survived enough to know what was coming next. Bumpy stood, hands folded behind his back. "They think we're quiet because we're scared," he said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. But quiet is just us deciding how loud we're going to get. One man asked the question everyone was thinking. What if the cops don't care? Bumpy looked at him for a long moment. Then we remind them why Harlem stays standing. There was no call for violence, no threats, just strategy. Watchers posted at corners, license plates written down. Outsiders followed, not confronted, not touched, just made aware they were seen. And then came the message that changed everything. A bartender leaned close and whispered into Bumpy's ear. His eyes narrowed just slightly. The Klansmen weren't gone. They were planning to come back. This time, not to send a warning, but to make an example. And they were confident. Confident because they believed the police would keep looking the other way. Bumpy straightened his coat. "Good," he said. "Let them come." Because the worst mistake of any enemy could make in Harlem was assuming patience meant weakness. And when the challenge finally came, it wouldn't be met in the shadows. It would be met face to face with witnesses. The second night came heavier than the first. No screams this time. No sudden violence. Just unfamiliar cars cruising too slow down familiar streets. Engines idling where they shouldn't. White men in dark coats lingering under streetlights, pretending to read newspapers they never turned. Harlem noticed everything. By midnight, word reached Bumpy Johnson exactly as he expected. The Klansmen were coordinating near the river, using a warehouse that had once stored produce but now held something uglier: certainty. They believed fear had already done half the work for them. Bumpy didn't rush. He sat in his apartment, coat folded neatly on the chair, reading a book of poetry by lamplight. Those who didn't know him mistook this calm for detachment. Those who did understood it as preparation. At 1:17 a.m., the phone rang. "They're moving," came the voice, toward 129th. Bumpy closed the book. "Good," he said again. What happened next was not chaos. It was coordination. Men stepped out of doorways. Windows went dark on cue. The streets narrowed, not physically, but psychologically. Outsiders felt it before they could explain it. That sense of being watched by something older, sharper, and deeply offended. The Klansmen made it 3 blocks before they realized they were alone. No crowd gathered, no threats were shouted, just the quiet presence of Harlem men standing where they belonged, unarmed, unmoving, unafraid. Veterans with steady eyes, shopkeepers with their sleeves rolled up, Men who had survived enough humiliation to know when enough was enough. One of the Klansmen laughed nervously. "Ain't this a free country?" he said. Bumpy Johnson stepped forward then, out of the darkness and into the streetlight. The men parted naturally to let him through. No announcement was needed. He looked at the group, taking them in, the stiffness in their shoulders, the way their confidence leaked out when confronted by reality instead of rumor. "You already had your free walk," Bumpy said, "last night." No one reached for a weapon. No fists were thrown. That was the point. "This is Harlem," he continued, "and you don't get to practice your courage here." The Klansmen backed away, muttering, retreating toward their cars. They left without bloodshed, but not without understanding. By morning, the rumor mill was spinning faster than ever. The Klan had been stopped, not by police, not by politicians, by the neighborhood itself. And that embarrassed people with power. At the precinct, the captain slammed his desk when he heard, "Johnson's stirring things up," he growled. "Thinks he runs this borough." A lieutenant hesitated. "Sir, maybe we should at least open an investigation." The captain looked up slowly. "Or maybe," he said, "we remind him who the law is." The message reached Bumpy by afternoon. The police wanted to talk. Officially. That was the real confrontation. Not with men in hoods, but with men in uniform who believed their badges made them untouchable. Bumpy buttoned his coat, slid his hat into place, and headed for the precinct. Because if authority wanted a meeting, it was about to learn the difference between power and legitimacy. The precinct smelled like old paper, cold coffee, and confidence that had never been challenged. Bumpy Johnson walked in just after 4 p.m. Alone. No entourage. No protection. The desk sergeant looked up, recognized him instantly, and stiffened. Conversations died mid-sentence. Phones stopped ringing. Every man in uniform felt the shift, even if they didn't know why. The captain was waiting in his office with the door open, a calculated show of authority. "Johnson," he said, leaning back in his chair, "you've been busy." Bumpy stepped inside without being invited. He didn't sit. "I came because your men didn't," Bumpy replied evenly. The captain smirked. "You don't tell this department how to do its job?" Bumpy nodded slowly, as if considering that. "Funny," he said, "because last night, when men were planning to hurt people in my neighborhood, your job was nowhere to be found." The captain's smile vanished. His voice hardened. "You accusing the NYPD of something, boy?" The word landed heavy, deliberate, meant to remind everyone in earshot exactly where the captain believed the line was drawn. The room went still. Bumpy didn't raise his voice. He didn't step closer. He simply met the captain's eyes. "No," he said, "I'm informing you." The captain stood abruptly, knocking his chair back. "You don't scare me, Johnson. You and your street theater don't mean a damn thing in this building." Bumpy turned slightly, letting the captain see the open doorway, the officers pretending not to listen, the clerks frozen at their desks. "This building," Bumpy said calmly, "only works if the street believes in it." The captain scoffed. "And what are you going to do if we don't?" Bumpy paused, long enough for the question to echo. "Nothing illegal," he said. "Nothing violent." Then he leaned forward just enough to be heard. "I'll make sure every newspaper in this city knows you let the Klan walk through Harlem untouched. I'll make sure every church, every union hall, every war veteran knows exactly who decided their safety wasn't worth a patrol car." The captain's face flushed. You threatening me? No, Bumpy said again. I'm offering you a chance. Silence stretched. Finally, the captain looked away. You're done here, he snapped. Bumpy adjusted his hat. One more thing, he said, turning back. Those men don't come back. Not tonight. Not ever. And if they do? The captain asked bitterly. Bumpy's voice was steady. Then the whole country will know why. He walked out without waiting for permission. Behind him, the captain stood frozen, realizing, perhaps for the first time, that authority without trust was just noise, and Harlem was done listening. Police cars rolled where they hadn't the night before. Slow, deliberate patrols. Officers stepped out at corners they usually ignored. Radios crackled with sudden urgency, as if the city had just remembered its own rules. By morning, the change was undeniable. The warehouse by the river was empty. The unfamiliar cars were gone. The men who had walked Harlem's streets with borrowed confidence had vanished back into the margins they came from. And for the first time since the attack, people talked openly again. At the barber shop, a man shook his head and said, "Ain't seen police like that in years." At church, the pastor paused mid-sermon to pray for protection and for vigilance. On stoops, elders nodded toward the precinct and said nothing, which meant everything. The victim survived. Bruised, shaken, alive. Bumpy visited quietly. No audience, no speeches. He sat at the bedside for 10 minutes, left an envelope for the family, and walked out before anyone could thank him. Justice to him didn't require applause. At City Hall, the phone lines lit up. Reporters called about rumors, about threats ignored, about hate groups roaming free, about why a neighborhood boss seemed to be doing the job of the police. Nobody put Bumpy's name on record. They didn't have to. Everyone knew who had forced the issue. Inside the precinct, the captain faced questions he wasn't prepared for. A deputy commissioner wanted explanations. A councilman wanted assurances. A memo circulated reminding officers of their duty to protect all citizens equally, written in language sharp enough to sting. No one mentioned the word Klan out loud, but patrol assignments changed. Reports were filed. And when an officer joked about street politics, nobody laughed. Harlem noticed that too. Bumpy Johnson didn't claim victory. He didn't issue warnings. He simply went back to his routine, walking the neighborhood, stopping to talk, listening more than he spoke. That was the message. Power didn't need to announce itself. Weeks passed. No more hoods. No more threats. The would-be invaders learned what others before them had learned. Harlem was not unguarded territory just because the law sometimes failed it. It guarded itself, and the police, whether they liked it or not, adjusted their posture accordingly. One afternoon, Bumpy passed the precinct again. The same desk sergeant nodded, this time without hesitation. A patrolman held the door open. No words were exchanged. Respect doesn't always arrive with apologies. Sometimes it shows up as changed behavior. And in Harlem, that counted. Because justice hadn't come from force. It hadn't come from revenge. It had come from exposure, from making silence impossible. The balance had shifted, not because a legend demanded it, but because he reminded everyone what happens when a community refuses to be erased. Years later, people would argue about what really happened that week. Some said Bumpy Johnson threatened the captain outright. Others claimed politicians stepped in behind closed doors. A few insisted the Klan never planned a second move at all. That was always the way with legends. What couldn't be argued was the outcome. From that moment forward, Harlem was no longer treated as open ground for intimidation. Hate groups learned quickly that the neighborhood had its own early warning system, one built on trust, memory, and collective resolve. And the police, whether out of pride or pressure, understood they would be watched just as closely as anyone else. Bumpy's reputation changed in subtle but important ways. Before, he'd been known as a power broker, a man who negotiated with mob bosses, outplayed numbers runners, and survived prisons meant to break him. After that week, he was something more complicated, a reminder that authority doesn't always wear a badge, and justice doesn't always arrive through official channels. Historians would later note the timing. Post-war America was struggling to define itself. Black veterans returned home to second-class citizenship. Northern cities pretended racism was a Southern problem. Harlem existed at the intersection of that denial. What happened there forced a reckoning. Small, quiet, but real. Bumpy Johnson never wrote it down. He never gave interviews. He never corrected the stories. He understood that legends grow stronger when they belong to the people, not the man. And the people remembered. They remembered how fear had tried to settle in and failed. They remembered how silence had been broken without a single shot fired. They remembered how dignity had been defended not with rage, but with resolve. Even the police remembered. New captains came and went. Policies shifted. But the lesson lingered in precinct lore. Harlem was not to be ignored, and Ellsworth Johnson was not a man to be underestimated. Not because he was violent, but because he was visible. When the law stepped aside, he stepped forward, not to replace it, but to expose it. That distinction mattered. Decades later, long after Bumpy was gone, elders still told the story to younger generations, not as a tale of gang power, but as a lesson in standing ground when institutions fail. They didn't say his name with fear. They said it with recognition. Because legends aren't built on domination. They're built on moments when someone chooses the harder path, the one that protects others without demanding credit. And in Harlem, that choice echoed far beyond that single week of terror. It became part of the neighborhood's spine. This wasn't just a story about hate walking into Harlem. It was a story about what happens when fear expects cooperation and meets memory instead. The Klan believed silence meant surrender. The police believed absence meant control. Both were wrong, because Harlem understood something deeper. Dignity doesn't wait for permission. And justice doesn't always arrive with a siren. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson didn't stop terror with violence. He stopped it with visibility, with pressure, with the unshakable truth that communities don't survive by begging to be protected. They survive by refusing to disappear. This moment didn't make him a legend. It confirmed why he already was. Not because he ruled Harlem, but because when the law turned its back, he stood where others stepped away. And sometimes that's all it takes to remind the world what respect really means.